I can't let Jim and Barry get away with some stories about grandchildren. I do have two little stories about one of my grandchildren, who's a 6-year-old. She reads to me when she comes to our house, and she reads stories seemingly effortlessly. The only difficulty I discovered after listening to her for a while was if I pointed to a word, she couldn't tell me what the word was. And I discovered that, in fact, she's very good at learning poems, and so she reads a storybook, eventually gets it in her memory, and rather like the child who can read with her eyes closed. There are some issues to do with pedagogy that we do need to address when we're talking about literacy instruction that go beyond curriculum. For example, she also said to me the other day, let's play this game, I Spy with My Little Eye. And being a phonemically aware person, this was grist to my mill. Yes, let's play I Spy with My Little Eye. And she started off with, I spy with my little eye, something starting with C. And it occurred to me that she had been taught to play I Spy, not in the phonologically helpful way with the sounds of letters, but in fact with the names of letters. So I want to talk to you today about some of those issues to do with curriculum and with pedagogy as well. We're going to look at the results of the studies that have taken place over. I decided to include our trans-Tasman cousins in the group of England, as it should be. Wherever you see GB, think of England, as that famous saying goes, rather than Great Britain, because, as Jim pointed out, it's more appropriate to talk about the studies and the curriculum for England than for the whole of Great Britain. So New Zealand's included in there as well because of some recent reviews and work that they've been doing in recent times. Why do we need these reports? Reading's been around for hundreds of years amongst the general population. Why now, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years? I want to put this notion of reading reports within the broader context of what impact might research have on what we do in the classroom. We've seen dramatic changes in the amount and quality of research over the last 20 years that might inform decision making, but we haven't seen a great deal until recently of research actually informing practice. Figures on problems in reading are not fixed in concrete. It rather depends how you assess reading as to what sort of figures you come up with. Here are some of the figures that have been written about in the US and in England. In Australia, we've had national testing, we've had state testing, and we've had benchmarks. And we've had testing largely of comprehension with multiple choice question answers. And there are some problems with that form of assessment. And so it does rather depend on what you read, whether you read of samples of students who've been assessed empirically by researchers with what sort of tests, or whether you look at government-sponsored research and reaching benchmarks that are very often anonymous. So I had a look at this rather alarming study, and again, I don't know how this was assessed, but those figures are pretty dreadful. It indicates a long-standing and still current issue to do with the way we teach reading. I guess whichever way or whichever set of figures you acknowledge, there is quite a clear problem with a proportion of our students who might be considered as arising from the disadvantaged population, the Indigenous population, but there may also be a hidden group who simply don't achieve as well as they might because of the issues of instruction. One of the problems in educational decision-making over the last at least 30 years, probably more than that, has been a tendency for decisions about what should constitute curriculum to be either left to in the hands of teachers, or to come from state education bureaucrats who may have had a trip to the US and heard some guru discussing their opinions about what a reading program might look like. And so we've had, for those of you who have been around in teaching, you would know we've had many different approaches to the teaching of reading over the last 30 years. The difference with these reports is that they're describing the results of empirical research rather than the results of anecdotes or people who think things might be a good idea to try. The results of ignoring research have been highlighted as a tale of our literacy distribution that's unacceptable to us, whatever it is, it's at an unacceptable level. And we've seen across a number of countries not much progress over the last 10 to 20 years, particularly the last 10 years, a flattening out of the impact that our instruction is having on making a dent in this tale of relatively low reading performance. And the argument that's being put forward in different countries is, well, it's a result of not paying attention to research. Ted Brealey made this comment relatively recently, again mirroring what has been described as taking place in the US. Why does research have a role to play in education? Those of you who are in the classroom would appreciate that there is a lot of pressure on teachers now to be able to produce results with their students. And these results are going to be determined by first state and now national assessment protocols. And should we actually be worried about research? If so, why? One reason why research is becoming central to the decisions about educational approaches is because in other fields, the adoption of research as the prime driver of the content of those professions has come about at a time when these professions are really making great gains. So data can tell us something. One of the impacts it might have, were we to adopt research as a prime determinant of practice, would be to reduce those sorts of pendulum swings that we've noticed, particularly over the last 30 years. How do these reports get compiled? Well, typically there will be some pressure exerted on a government, often by parents and other bodies that have some influence. The government will investigate the establishment of a committee. We all know from Yes Minister that whenever you are hit with a problem in government, you instigate a committee. In these cases, we're seeing committees that are often taking their membership from researchers as well as people within the education system directly involved with children. The idea is for them to go through the research, to look at the many research studies and to see what can be gleaned as reaching some sort of consensus about what might be helpful in the beginning teaching and in the teaching of those students who are already struggling. They use statistical processes to try to reach conclusions from many disparate studies. And that's often been very difficult for people who don't have a strong background in research design to be able to read one paper and to relate those results with the results of another paper, and so on. So the reports that I've had a look at have included these: the National Reading Panel, the National Early Literacy Panel, the National Inquiry into the Teaching of Literacy, the Rose Report, and the New Zealand study as well. There are some very similar assertions that are made across all of these reports. And they may sound very obvious, but there have been times when these assertions have not been acknowledged as true. All children can learn. It was once thought that children's performance was determined either genetically or in the first few years of their life, and that schooling could not have a great deal of impact on children's progress. And that was a very strong feeling in the 60s and 70s. Reports such as the Coleman report came out in 1966 suggested that children from low socioeconomic areas were doomed to failure and that teachers really couldn't have any impact. We've moved, fortunately, from that position, and research has shown us the potential power of instruction. So neither biology nor SES necessarily determines destiny. If we don't provide the right resources, however, it is a very strong predictor of a rather sad destiny. And the effects of teaching make a huge difference, or at least have the potential to make a huge difference. There is a lot of research coming out of the US and Hattie in New Zealand, for example, who highlight the potential power of instruction to compensate for biological disadvantage and early environmental disadvantage. One of the things too that research in these studies has highlighted is that those who are most vulnerable to failure are the ones who are also most sensitive to the effects of teaching. So as teaching improves, so too does the output of vulnerable students, more so than how the quality of teaching might impact on those who are better than average to start with. Early detection is a very strong theme in each of these reports. The earlier we detect children who might present with reading difficulties, the easier it is to have an impact, the less resources it takes to have an impact, and the effect on those children's self-esteem is incalculable. Well, perhaps not quite incalculable. There is quite a burgeoning body of research highlighting the mental health implications of failure to learn to read. And those implications continue right through from childhood through to adulthood. The National Reading Panel had a number of things to say. We've already heard from Jim about the issue of phonemic awareness and about phonics, but the National Reading Panel said not only is it important to include phonemic awareness and phonics in a beginning reading program, but also the way in which those are presented, that is the pedagogy, makes a huge difference. So that just providing activities in phonics or phonemic awareness does not guarantee the sorts of outcomes that the National Reading Panel has highlighted. So the terms that they've used there systematically and explicitly, so that it's not something that is simply added to an existing literature program or added to an existing whole language program or an existing whole word program, but rather it's an approach that becomes the first line of attack. And so it is not simply included or mentioned at teachable moments, but rather it is taught even in isolation from other aspects of reading to ensure that it is in fact mastered. So it's about appreciating the sounds in words. The letter names are of less significance at this time. It's about appreciating that the sounds in words can be manipulated independently of the word's meaning. So this is actually paying attention to the structure of, firstly, the spoken word, and that's where phonemic awareness plays its part. But phonemic awareness of itself is of no great interest other than it being a fun activity if we did not have an alphabetic language. So those approaches that have been most successful in the research in increasing children's reading progress have been those that have directly tied the phonemic awareness activities, in particular the activities of blending and segmenting, but have tied those to the letter sounds as early as possible. It is possible too to have an independent, discrete phonemic awareness program, and many children will absorb the skills involved in becoming phonologically more aware, but it's likely to be the more advantaged children who can see how to generalise that to reading. The children at the tail of our distribution that we're most worried about, let's call it, say, 20%, those are the children who are more likely to maintain the discreteness of any phonemic awareness they develop and won't necessarily see how to apply that to the task of reading unless we make the explicit link. The panel highlighted 5 areas in the teaching of reading. The phonemic awareness and phonics is about the structure of words. They also highlighted the need for fluency, that is, ensuring practice that takes children beyond simply the level of mastery of something, but rather to the level of fluency, that is, they can do it with little or no effort or attention expended in carrying out the activity. So the violinist that Jim talked about, the knitter who can carry on a conversation and watch TV while making the Essendon jumper for her grandchild. Those sorts of activities are done at a level of fluency. There's no need for thinking about them, they just happen. And fluency has been one of the forgotten areas in our education system, that is providing enough practice so that children can not only do a task but can do it with little or no effort. In the case of reading, the big payoff for fluency is that children, all of us, have a limited amount of attentional capacity. And when we have to devote it to making sense of what's on the page, getting the words off the page, we have less of our attentional capacity left for making sense, in other words, for comprehension. As fluency increases, comprehension of itself improves, that is, measured comprehension. Of course, we still need the oral language component, as Jim described before, in order for children to be able to know the words that they're getting off the page. But the major problem I see, at least in our RMIT psychology clinic, we see many children with reading problems. The major problem for most of them is getting the words off the page readily, accurately and fast. And teaching reading comprehension strategies, including vocabulary. Vocab's an interesting one because the greatest increase in vocab occurs through reading, and for children who don't read, their vocab is going to be constrained from that point on. After about grade 3, reading is the major determinant of continued vocab growth. Far more rare words in books than there are in conversation, in TV programs, even in lectures like this. So teaching comprehension strategies along with vocab is very important, even if it's not the whole story. Systematic and explicit, there are those terms again. Systematic meaning you have a curriculum that is logical, that covers all the necessary components and does so in an order which is most likely to evoke success. Explicit means that you are doing it independent of other activities at the time, so that if you were teaching phonics, you wouldn't necessarily do it in the context of reading a big book story, but rather you would do it in the context of displaying letters, pointing out those letter sounds and engaging the children in activities that involve blending those sounds together. Certainly the final product is comprehension of written text, but that doesn't mean that that has to be the process by which you achieve success. The research is saying it is fine to teach explicitly, systematically, components of reading one at a time. And in particular, when we talk about the simple view that Jim mentioned before, that makes it gives one carte blanche to teach decoding independently of text reading. And indeed, the research is suggesting that that's more effective, particularly for those who are likely to be strugglers. It should begin early, but of course it's not a total reading program. There has been a criticism over the years that people who advocate phonics seem to have a blinker that phonics is everything and that phonics will produce skilled readers. And the criticism has been that it produces children who bark at print. I do wish that many of the kids I've worked with could bark at print. In fact, they are mostly silent in the face of print. Barking at print is simply an indication that a child's vocabulary has not caught up with their decoding. That's a relatively rare situation compared to the converse for most children who struggle. Relatively recently, a second body, the National Early Literacy Study, released its results early this year. Those were released, and unsurprisingly, I guess, it says if you are going to introduce literacy activities early, that could be in the preschool year, then the same sorts of approaches that are effective for children in the classroom are likely to be effective for younger children as well. Now, that's talking about literacy. We know from Hart and Risley's work how important vocabulary is too. And we constantly come back to these two components. Having the ability to comprehend to spoken sentences and having the capacity to make use of one's linguistic comprehension when faced with the written text. In New Zealand, we see something similar in their relatively new findings that have found their way into a curriculum. The word that is present in all of these reports is the importance of the code. You might remember back 20 or 30 years ago, there was the expression cracking the code. It sort of fell into disrepute during the whole language years, in which the idea was that simply reading text is sufficient to evoke reading text, which further evokes reading text. In other words, you learn to read by reading. It was an approach that staggered one's common sense, but which was accepted by a large number of teacher training institutions and in-service training providers, that simply providing text is sufficient to evoke reading. Because it may be true in a few cases, certainly doesn't make it true across the population, and even further from the truth for those students who are of most concern to us. So you can see that we're seeing a bit of a pattern arising already here, that the code is very important, and the components of the code are knowing the grapheme, phoneme correspondences and how to play with them, how to put them together, how to blend phonemes together to make words, how to segment words into phonemes. The Australian National Inquiry into the Teaching of Literacy. Before I go on, I should remind you that the overheads from this and I believe the other presentations will go up on the website for LDA over the next couple of weeks. The term explicitly comes up again. That is, it's not something one does incidentally, but something that one focuses upon in a structured way in the teaching of these components. The word code comes up again. And the inquiry was quite clear about what the manner of pedagogy should be as well. It didn't actually say, here's directly how to do it. If you want an example of how a curriculum can also include pedagogy, you could look at the California frameworks in reading, which were introduced when California went from second highest achieving state in the US down to the second lowest over a period of the 10 years that they adopted whole language as their method of instruction. When they moved away from that model and took on an explicit research-directed model, they wrote a very explicit curriculum, and it's available on the web. You can have a look at it. It specifies what to teach, how to teach it, when to teach it, and also how to assess regularly the success with which you have been teaching it. So the National Inquiry makes it clear, direct explicit, systematic phonics instruction is a major component of the initial teaching of reading. It remains to be seen how effective that will be in our own national curriculum. Jim's talked to some degree about what's taking place in England, and I'll just say a couple of things then about his report. Another common feature here has been early identification, the importance of identifying early rather than waiting for a number of years before deciding that the child has a problem. In our clinic, we see children largely from year 3, 4 and above, and up until recently have seen very few young children with reading problems. And the parents almost invariably explain to us that yes, they did suspect that little Jamie had a problem with reading, but they were assured by schools, by their teachers over successive years, that it will all click eventually. And by about year 4, it's clear that it hasn't clicked. And that's one of the reasons why early detection is so important. It's also because it's much easier for both the child and for the teacher and for the system to intervene early. The simple view of reading, which Jim alluded to, replaces searchlights. Searchlights, for those of you familiar with the 3 queuing system, the searchlights model in the 1998 National Literacy Strategy in England favoured the simultaneous use of syntactic, semantic and, if necessary, graphophonic cues to drive reading, and in some way a child incorporates each of those and seamlessly they interact to allow for skilled reading. The 3 queuing system has been a disaster for children who have been asked to guess words, to look at the initial letter and have a guess at the word, to look at a picture. In that model, almost any means of achieving a sense of what's on a page is considered to be okay. The research is saying that's not the best way to go, and the simple view of reading that Jim talked about says reading. Sorry, that's the searchlight model that I've just described. Let me jump forward. That reading comprehension, the most critical outcome of reading, is the product of the ability to get the words off the page and the ability to understand words once you've got them off the page. Those 2 components, it's surprising how such an apparently simple approach to reading instruction has such a potentially powerful impact on students. So we can address each of those, but not necessarily at the same time. And that's a very important change. Jim also referred in the Rose report to synthetic phonics, and that's contrasted with analytic phonics. The key features in this synthetic phonics approach is that you teach the structure of words separately to literature, that you teach it by looking at the initial sounds in words, the phoneme, grapheme correspondences, and the skills of segmenting and blending. And that this is the prime approach to figuring out what a word says. Children are taught this is number 1, this is where you start. Even in those cases where you introduce irregular words shortly after beginning synthetic phonics, or even at the same time, hopefully not before, but even if you do it at the same time, it's still possible to talk about that method. In one of the programs we use in the clinic, for example, a word like said might be included relatively early in a teaching sequence, but the approach of sounding out the letters in the word remains. So the child would be instructed with a statement something like this. Sound out this word for me. S-A-I-T. S-A-I-T. I can't get any word from that, sir. Ah, well, that's one of those tricky words. It sounds s-a-i-t, but we say it's said. we'll say it the fast way. When we see it, we'll just say said. So the child is not dissuaded from sounding out words, but rather is taught within that framework that when it doesn't work, we may need to resort to recollection of those words. And of course, the first sound and the last sound in the sounded out word is correct. It's the medial vowels that present the problem in this particular word. And the impact then is the child becomes, as part of their strategy, their initial approach will be sounding out rather than guessing, looking for pictures, working off the first sound, or looking at the context of the sentence. Common terms in the recommendations that we've seen so far have been these. Evidence-based is an interesting term. There are a couple of terms that one tends to see in the literature. One is scientifically based, another is evidence-based. It might sound as though they're synonymous, but they're not quite. Anyone can develop a reading program and call it scientifically based if it has, for example, some attention to the 5 components of the National Reading Panel's description. That doesn't mean that it's effective, however. If it's consistent with theory, there's probably a chance that it's effective, but it still depends on the pedagogy. It depends how it's implemented. Evidence-based programs, however, are those that have already been subjected to empirical test and are known to have been effective. So one might be theoretically okay, but practically useless, and the second has been shown to work. So evidence-based approaches is the concept that one's looking for. Frequent progress monitoring is not something that education has been renowned for in the past, but with the rise of curriculum-based measures that can be done very quickly with individual children, for example, 1-minute timed reading samples, these are the sorts of things a teacher can do very quickly, individually in most cases, at a regular intervals, which could be weekly, fortnightly, something like that. Second and third wave or second and third tier interventions involve when the first wave or first tier, depending on which country is using the term, has introduced its evidence-based approach to the initial teaching of reading. There will inevitably still be some children, presumably rather fewer, presenting with difficulties. They will be noticed early because of the regular assessment and will be provided with increased intensity or a variation of the program. There are various options, but second tier involves catching those children before they fail and introducing additional instruction to them. And third tier will often include children with intellectual disability, maybe children with thought to have a specific learning disability like dyslexia, and special provision, more detailed assessment and special provision possibly made for them. Here's an example of the sort of productive nature of teaching a sequence of sounds and how to put them together and how they might be helpful in then giving the child the capacity to read a rather larger number of words than one might anticipate. The problem with my 6-year-old grandchild memorising all the words in sentences is that she'd probably get away with it until about year 3, because the vocab that is necessary to make sense of text up to about grade 3 is really only 300, 400 words. If you've got those in your visual memory, you'll be able to make sense. You mightn't be very accurate, but generally you'll get the gist of what's being read, and you may fool those who are assessing your reading if all they're giving you is comprehension measures, particularly those using multiple choice as answers. And might I say that the problem that I see with that form of assessment is if there are 4 answers, you've got a 25% chance of getting it right without knowing anything. And if the benchmark is set at 30%, then you're not going to have too many reading problems. Unfortunately, we don't really know where benchmarks are set in most countries. That's not something that's provided. So if you have 40 questions and you've got a 25% chance of getting 10 of them right, if the benchmark is 13 correct, then what does that mean? So we've still got a fair way to go. This is not to criticise national assessment schemes, but rather we've got to do better than the formats that we're currently using. Examples or negative examples of non-systematic teaching would include these: introducing all the letter sounds at once, failing to teach all the sounds, failing to provide sufficient practice. Introducing letter names simultaneously can present difficulties, not to most children, but to the tail of the distribution. It makes it unnecessarily complex. Many children, of course, already come knowing their letter names, but emphasising the two together can present difficulties. And then explaining a phonics rule without actually providing text that would reinforce children's use of that phonic rule. So if you give them a phonic rule and then you give them what's called inconsiderate text, also known as authentic text, it's possible that by chance that the words that are used in that text are a high proportion of irregular words, and children then are likely to be dissuaded from using the strategy that you've been highlighting. Synthetic phonics I've already described. It's starting with the sounds and how to blend them together. Of the phonological skills, blending and segmenting are the highest level. You don't need to be the world's champion at phonemic awareness. As long as you have sufficient phonemic awareness to enable you to do those tasks, blending and segmenting, then that's sufficient. And one shouldn't spend too much time on phonological tasks like that if one doesn't need to. In analytics, sometimes called implicit phonics as opposed to explicit, in analytic phonics you tend to start, because synthesis implies building up from the start and analysis implies breaking down from the whole. With analytic phonics, we tend to see teachers giving children whole words prior to asking them to consider the structure of those words. The evidence isn't entirely clear for all children as to whether synthetic is superior to analytic, but it is clear that synthetic phonics makes more sense to those who are likely to struggle than does analytic phonics. And so in England, we're seeing a strong emphasis on synthetic phonics. In the National Inquiry, they support synthetic phonics. In the National Reading Panel, they don't make a judgment either way about whether synthetic or analytic phonics. They simply say there's not enough research available. And that's a continuing issue. When do we have enough research to say, here is what you should do? Differences in recommendations. The National Inquiry was a little bit coy in regard to the use of the simple view. It gave the possibility that one might interpret it as continuing to support the 3 queuing system, in which children's attack on an unknown word could include context, syntactical, semantic sorts of approaches. And though the other reports, such as the National Reading Panel and the Rose Report, make it quite clear that synthetic approaches are more appropriate. The differences regarding decodable text. How much decodable text? Should you have any? Decodable text simply means that at the point this child is along the road to knowing all their phonics skills, should you provide them with text that is consistent with the skills they have so far, or should you just provide them with whatever story interests them, which may or may not contain a lot of words that don't obey those rules. Should you firm children up on their phonics skills first using complementary reading material, or do you let them go for it? It's not clear yet what proportion of decodable text might be useful. It's generally considered that for struggling kids, decodable text is often a useful scaffold. The National Inquiry indicated that there was no real divide between whole language and phonics approaches, which seemed a bit disingenuous to many of us, and was perhaps a response to trying to please everybody. What about these research-based practices? They may be made mandatory, as in some countries, or they may be tied to funding, as it was in the US. It's yet to be seen how one can actually mandate practice. One can mandate curriculum, but what takes place in the classroom can vary dramatically, as the experience in England showed after the 1998 National Literacy Strategy. Trying to actually get the system to change is quite a difficult thing to do. Continuous assessment, of course, would help in that area. I should stop there. There is a great deal more that one could say about this issue, but I think what we've seen from the various reports we've looked at has been certainly a confluence about what's important in the initial teaching of reading. We haven't talked about subsequent attempts to redress reading problems, but in the initial teaching of reading we're seeing, I guess in summary, the components that are considered to be crucial, and even more significantly for those children who are likely to be strugglers. If we're going to alter the tail of the distribution, we have the direction that we should be taking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry. I might mention that Barry made the point that Bill Loudon was a member of the NITL committee and a member of the national curriculum, so he's going to be keeping an eye out on whether those two things are saying the same thing, and I think that's part of his brief, which is an excellent idea. Jim mentioned that one of the important